Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Is the NDA government justified in wanting to replace Congress-appointed governors? Do Supreme Court judgments prevent that? And are reluctant governors standing up for principle or fighting for their own jobs? That's the debate in part two. But first, the developing crisis in Iraq. Is the country hurtling towards partition? How serious is the situation facing Indians caught in the turmoil? And could the same thing happen in Afghanistan when the Americans leave that country? That's the first big debate tonight. And now joining me to discuss the situation in Iraq is the former Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General Ashraf Ghazi, India's former Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman and the United Arab Emirates, Talmiz Ahmed, former Deputy National Security Advisor Leela Punapa, and former Ambassador to Iran and former Secretary in the MEA, KC Singh. Ashraf Ghazi, let me start with a simple question. Are you surprised by the way ISIL has taken over large parts of northern Iraq, as well as the speed with which this has happened? Or did the way the situation in Syria was developing make this predictable, if not also perhaps inevitable?
Well, I think most people, and certainly including me, were taken enormously by surprise by the rapidity with which these developments have taken place. I think one knew that the situation in Syria had the potential to spill over into Iraq, and Iraq had its own dynamic which was far from positive, but that the two would meld together and bring about such a rapid development of events, I think this was difficult to anticipate, although I have read analyses where it suggested that that a number of behind-the-scenes players were well in the know and might even have had a hand in these developments.
So you're suggesting that in fact there might have been a certain amount of complicity on the part of the very element of a government in Iraq itself. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying there are suggestions that intelligence agencies which operate in huge secrecy may have had an influence on these developments, which otherwise should have been anticipated by conventional observers of the scene. But it seems it was part of the overall possibility, but I think nobody anticipated the rapidity with which the whole of northern Iraq would fall to the ISIS so rapidly. And we also can't tell what the likely trends are going to be. Is this going to be a two-week wonder, or is this a true transformation of the scene in Iraq and indeed in the region?
Now, Talmiz Ahmed, according to reports today, the ISIL forces have reached Baquba, which is barely 60 miles from the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. How do you, sitting in Dubai, explain to yourself why the Iraqi forces crumbled, if not in some places completely melt away?
I think there is a long history behind this. There was a professional non-sectarian force that had been put together a few years ago, but the present Iraqi government, led by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, had a very strong and robust sectarian agenda. Because of that, large sections of non-Shia elements within the armed forces were made to leave, or they were made very, very unwelcome. I think this was, and therefore finally the Iraqi army that was left behind was a rump element that is largely poorly trained and seriously non-professional. What happened in the case of Mosul is that these senior officers abandoned even this army and fled away. And therefore these youngsters had no choice but to shed their uniform and become part of the general populace. This particular problem is part of the larger concern that we should have with regard to sectarianism, not only in regard to Iraq, but also across the region that is burgeoning right before our eyes.
Now, in the light, Mr. KC Singh, of what you heard from Talmiz Ahmed, do you believe that the Iraqi government can regain any element of the territory that it's lost? I know that after an initial pushback, ISIL is once again gaining ground today, or at least it's comfortably holding on to what it's got. So do you think the Iraqi forces, no matter how they may boost their morale by talking big, can actually win back what they've lost?
They can't do it by themselves. They've been seeking air cover, which they don't have from the Americans for the last month or so. The two external forces which can help in rolling back the ISIS are the US and the Iranians. And the Iranians are already there. There are anecdotal reports that General Soleimani, who heads the Quds force, is there. IRGC officers have been reported to have been sighted there. So it's the kind of input which went into the Assad army, which made the Assad army stand there with the help of Hezbollah, is what is being tried. Also Muqtada al-Sadr, whose Shia brigade had been wrapped up and he had gone away to Iran, even he is resurfaced. So therefore many of these Shia militia elements will resurface, and that is a dangerous element because they may not go into the Iraqi army, but you may have a militiaization of the Shia territory, which is not welcome.
And this militiaization will be outside the control of the Iraqi Prime Minister.
That is why Grand Ayatollah Sistani in the beginning said, I call upon all youngsters to rise up. And then he amended it and he said, no, you must only join the army, because what he didn't want is these militias to be revived.
There's a very interesting picture emerging, Leela Punapa. Do you get the feeling when you listen to everyone that Iraq is not just caught in a terrible civil war, but worse still, it seems to be moving towards, maybe even sometimes hurtling towards, a partition where it eventually ends up divided into a Shia segment, a Sunni segment and a Kurd segment? Does that look like the most natural, likely future for that country?
Unfortunately, partition is partition, whereas it only creates more problems. I think what we are seeing today in Iraq isn't restricted to the lines that we have on a map, but to the forces that are coming in from Syria, the role of Hezbollah, the role of Iran, and the social contract that Iraq as a state used to have in the earlier days. It was one of the most progressive countries in the region, and that social contract has been shattered. So certainly there are going to be fissures, deep faults that exist within the Iraqi state as we know it. But whether there's going to be partition or not is frankly, the fact that this present situation itself has arisen, I think is serious enough. And as we know, even in our lifetime, boundaries are not sacrosanct. So states readjust, states emerge. And I think what's happening in Iraq and in the region has a huge portent in terms of the kinds of forces that are influencing this. It goes back to Sykes-Picot of 98 years ago. Okay. And that did not solve anything either.
Ashraf Qazi, there is talk in today's papers of a possible coordination between Tehran and Washington in response to developments in Iraq which worry both those capitals enormously. They're meeting in Geneva tomorrow, admittedly, to discuss the nuclear issue. But do you really think cooperation between these two, who have been not just rivals but enemies for over 30 years, is possible at this point? Or is that really just journalistic speculation?
No, anything is possible. There is a certain commonality of interests here, but unfortunately, looking at the larger picture of US-Iran relations, the commonalities are somewhat superficial and not enough for a joint strategy to come into play. I think both of them are, of course, concerned with the rise of Sunni extremism, which they both oppose for different reasons. But the Iranians oppose any kind of American intervention in Iraq, and the Americans would always be suspicious suspicious about a greater Iranian role in Iraq, even if it is to sort of contain the common foe or the common enemy. So yes, there is a degree of coordination. I find the Iranians much more pragmatic to that. It's the Americans who are far more ideological and rigid about cooperation with Iran, and with an election coming up or a midterm election, I find it very difficult for the American administration to pursue this beyond a limited point.
Two very quick questions to you, Tulmiz Ahmed. First of all, from your vantage point in Dubai, how is the possibility of American-Iranian cooperation to tackle the emerging problem, the escalating problem, I should say, in Iraq viewed? How do Arab governments view that possibility?
Firstly, many important changes are taking place across this region, as you well know. The recent concerns, the recent divide between Saudi Arabia and Iran is a direct result of the challenge of the Arab Spring. And in order to divert attention from reform, certain countries of the region demonized Iran and suggested that Iran had a sectarian agenda. With regard to the United States, something very important is taking place. The Americans have realized that this kind of estrangement from such a major energy and geopolitical entity makes no sense whatsoever. I personally see that there will be a certain substantial dialogue between the two countries, between the United States and Iran, and in the short and in the medium term, there has to be a coming together, dialogue and coordination between Saudi Arabia and the Iranians as well. As of now, no one wants to see any country intervening directly in the affairs of another country.
Okay.
And I personally feel that neither the Iranians nor the Americans should intervene directly in the affairs of Iraq.
Let me move to that second question and put it to you, Mr. K.C. Singh. Tony Blair, who's very much a lone voice and quite often, in fact, an isolated voice in British politics, has nonetheless spoken of the need for fresh military involvement in Iraq by the West. Even if that is extremely unlikely, do you think Obama, who must be deeply concerned by what's happening, could contemplate anything more than just airstrikes?
I doubt it very much. I think going into the elections, the public fatigue with any intervention abroad, President Obama's political capital is depleting. I don't see how. And also we've seen what he did in case of Syria. Despite the red lines, he still caught the first live buoy thrown at him by the Russians, rather than even do an air strike, because he realizes that never stops at that. You cannot begin with an air strike and just leave it at that, and that can at best stop ISIS. It cannot rule it back.
So you are ruling out, despite the rhetoric from Blair, any possibility of any major Western involvement in Iraq?
At this stage, it seems unlikely, and I think what US would be doing is, in fact, the shoe is on the other foot. I would disagree with my good friend Talmiz. I don't think Americans and the Iranians, that's what they said yesterday. We can have some understanding, but there's not going to be a joint operation.
But certainly Kerry is sounding as if he's keen on an understanding, even if the White House takes a different note.
If you recall, even on Syria, the red lines remark originally had come, the surrender of the chemical weapons statement had come from Kerry. Then the others kind of ran onto it. But I don't think it is possible. I'll tell you why. Because the Iranians would want concessions on the nuclear issue, which the Americans would not be willing to give.
All right, let's broaden our horizon a little, Leela Punappa. Meanwhile, how serious is the situation, or maybe I should say, how desperate is the situation facing Indians' court in those territories that ISIL has now overrun? According to today's Hindu, there could be as many as 100 nurses stranded in towns like Tikrit and Mosul, and there's believed to be another 15 other Indians in Mosul and 7 more in Nasiraya. How critical is the situation for those people?
Before I answer that, I just have a couple of very quick points. One of your earlier speakers said somebody should have foreseen this situation. How come it wasn't foreseen? I think ever since the time of Desert Storm, the manner in which the Americans have intervened and really shattered every institution of the Iraqi nation. The writing was on the wall, and this was a disaster waiting to happen. The point about the Americans and the Iranians, I don't think the Americans
We're running
have much
out of
of a
time.
choice.
I'd rather
America
you concentrate on our nurses now.
Iran right now is centrally located.
Can you concentrate on our
last
nurses?
question, the Indians. On the Indians, I understand there are 46 nurses. There are 46 nurses in a hospital in the area that has been overrun by ISIS, but that the hospital itself has not been targeted. I believe the government of India is working through the Red Crescent, the Islamic Red Crescent, in order to try to make sure that they remain in communication. The others, there are approximately 100 Indians all told. The others are scattered in other parts of the country, and contact is being maintained. But at this stage, given the ground situation, I'm told evacuation in the manner that has taken place in other countries, Lebanon, Kuwait, way back in '92 and so on, that is not going to be feasible at this point of time because of an uncertain situation.
Talmiz Ahmed, there's someone who's actually been ambassador in many of the countries around the vicinity of Iraq. Are we in a position to arrange an airlift of these people who are now stranded in ISIL-held territory, or does that critically depend on these people first securing safe passage from ISIL-held cities to Baghdad?
I think that the challenge is quite serious because you are not dealing with a ragtag group. You are dealing with a very serious militia that is extremely well armed, it is extremely well funded, and it is deeply hostile to the Iraqi government. So if you were to send a team in order to negotiate the safe passage of our people, you will get very little support from the Iraqi government itself. And I have not seen ISIS, in a negotiation mode so far. So it's going to be a serious challenge. But I believe that we should send a team to Baghdad fairly quickly so that we can open channels of communication. Now, I should also clarify to you that ISIS is not a monolithic entity. It has got jihadis, it has got Baathis, it's got former soldiers, and it has got tribal chiefs and professionals who are all of them brought together because they are now deeply unhappy with the Maliki government. I think elements do exist within this entity who might be accommodative of some of our interests.
All right. Very quickly before I go back to Ashraf Qazi and talk a little bit about what this means for the situation that will develop in Afghanistan, because that's another one of concern for us, let me put this to you. The Indian government has issued a formal statement where they have condemned the takeover of northern Iraq by ISIL. They've actually called ISIL terrorists. Does that make the position of Indians held hostage in ISIL-controlled territory worse?
Are they hostages? That's the first place. ISIL may not be
the
even
nurses
aware.
describe themselves as hostages.
If they are aware of them. But remember that one of the funds of the, one of the sources of funding of ISIS in the past have been Europeans taken hostage in Syria for whom money has been paid by European entities. So therefore it's in the past been using hostages to extract money. Now I don't know whether they require money any longer. But they are also manifesting a very ruthless streak.
But has the position of the Indians caught in ISIL territory been made worse by the fact that we've called them terrorists?
I don't know the thinking at the top level, but I would agree with Talmiz to the extent there are some senior Baathist elements from the old Saddam Hussein order who are there in the higher echelons. Whether we are able to contact them or not, I don't know.
Ashraf Qazi, I want to now broaden the discussion. Does the collapse of the Noor al-Maliki government, or the imminent collapse, I should say, raise worrying questions about what will happen in Afghanistan after the Americans leave? Do you believe that the collapse of a successor regime there and a Taliban takeover looks now more likely? It's something everyone fears in India, and I imagine you fear it in Pakistan too. Does it now look more likely?
I think the connection between these two is indirect and much more complex than that. Number one, it is far from certain that the Maliki government will collapse, although that is a real possibility, and many might think that it's an essential condition for stability to return to Iraq. And many would point out maybe a leader like Ayad Alawi as somebody who is a Shia but has Sunni support and who actually got the most number of votes in the last election, might be a candidate. But Iraq is a much more recent country and in a sense a more artificial product of a World War I, than Afghanistan, which is 267 years old and which does not have a secessionist movement despite all the infighting and the external interference, conflict and interventions that have taken place. I think Afghanistan's unity is still stronger and more resilient than that of Iraq, but anything could happen. These elections which are underway, or the results of which are now awaited in Afghanistan, are going to be very important.
Let me ask you a second question. Your government in Pakistan has also now launched a ground offensive in North Waziristan. Many people in India believe that this was an essential step that your government should take to ensure that any blowback of terror from Afghanistan to India was in a way obstructed. How serious is this ground offensive? I noticed that Imran Khan this time around is fully supporting Nawaz Sharif. Therefore, do you believe your political establishment and your military establishment are together this time around?
Well, that is what is being said, and there's been a general consensus of support for the operation, not only from all the political parties, with the exception of the Jamaat-e-Islami, but from public opinion as well. Many think this action should have been taken a long while back. Other political leaders said they had to prepare the way and make it clear that it was impossible to negotiate with them, but at last the right step does seem to be taken. Now the question is, can it be seen through to the end? Can we achieve all the objectives of this counter-terrorist operation? It's going to be very complex, very extended, and there are going to be consequences and blowback. Can we withstand them?
You know, I don't have time for a very long question, but I'm trying to combine together two thoughts. The fact that there is a credible operation being launched against the jihadis in North Waziristan, and our fear of blowback from Afghanistan, which in a way is similar to many Indians to what's happening in Iraq. Do we get greater reassurance from the fact that the Pakistanis are biting this bullet internally, and does that give us some comfort when we look down the road and wonder what's going to happen in Afghanistan and how will that affect us, and could we end up facing a mess like Iraq?
Three quick points. One is that the ones they're going after, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, are not the ones who are coming after India. The ones who are coming after India are the Punjabi Taliban or elements from the Haqqani group who are going after our embassies. Secondly, there's a lesson for the Afghan government. The next president would like to look at the status of forces agreement very seriously and have US troops stay on. The mistake that Prime Minister Maliki made was that he did not allow a residual element of US troops to stay on in Iraq. So he's completely without air cover.
You'll only have 10,000 at best for another 6 months, and that's all.
But it provides air cover and intelligence, which is critical for an army. Army cannot operate without.
So we're more comfortable when we look down the road and ask the question, and could Afghanistan go Iraq's way? Your answer is don't worry too much.
Well, at least not worry as much as we need to worry about Iraq.
Very, very quickly, Leader Punapa, do you agree with that view, or do you want to give a contrarian one? But you've got literally 20 seconds.
Okay, in 20 seconds, I'd say that there are extremist forces that are surfacing, and this is really the commonality between what's happening in Iraq and what's happening in, not just in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan. So I do believe that whether the fears that we have, actually the concerns that we have with regard to the blowback of the American withdrawal are likely to be somewhat detached from what Pakistan is doing in North Waziristan, the full details of which we are yet to get.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to have to end this particular story there. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me, and in particular, Talmiz Ahmed and Ashraf Qazi, who joined us from Dubai and Islamabad.